Okay. Oh, I'm live. That's really weird. Are we live? This is really odd. Oh my gosh.
What it says.
That's what it says. Well, we have no... Shall I play the intro music anyway? Just to give myself 2 seconds. I think I should. Hello and welcome to the dark side. I had to play the intro music just to give myself a couple of seconds. We were having some technical difficulties. We apologize for those that joined straight away. Welcome to the dark side. Hi, Mr. Storm.
What's up?
So today is the last show before the season break. We have a 2-week break. We will see you in 3 weeks. But before we do that, we have news. And we are going to get straight in there. And we also are happy today to take any questions that you may have. Maybe there's a news story that's been bothering you and you want to discuss it. Which does remind me, there was one news story that was requested that we will touch on later. If you're here, the person that requested that, just pop it in the comment section and I will remember to touch on that story because it got quite twisted and quite interesting very quickly. All right, so Sri Lanka is our first news story for today. There is a humanitarian crisis that is taking place over there. Basically, there are severe shortages of fuel, food, medicine. But what has happened is it seems to have unified the people against the ruling class there, the Rajapaksa family. And this is kind of really unprecedented. So the people have been quite divided. There's been a lot of obviously they're coming off of the back of a civil war, and they were like the success story country, which I found to be quite an interesting way that the newspapers were framing it, but that maybe is something for us to discuss on the dark side. But they had long-standing ethnic, religious, linguistic, regional kind of, fault lines in the country. They had 3 decades worth of civil war, and then they have finally unified. But what happened was, due to mismanagement, due to corruption within government, we all know what that's...
Did you say they've unified?
Well, they unified on the streets now against this ruling class. So they're not unified, no, but they're actually all out on the streets protesting together, which is...
No, I just needed clarity because the reality is there was an act of genocide which the international community just ignored.
Yes.
Right? And that's where we find ourselves today in Sri Lanka. Look, yeah. Anyway, carry on. Sorry.
No, it's fine. I mean, you know about this as well as I do. So, there are some things, of course, that really strike us as we're all grappling with the effects of inflation at the moment. Food inflation there is 25%, so that's really high. Overall inflation is 18%. The currency is one of the worst performing currencies within the Asian markets, and life is really tough and the people are really struggling. And of course, in the midst of all of this, there are rolling shortages of energy, etc. So they have rolling power blackouts. There's nationwide protests. There's opposition are trying to garner enough support to overthrow the current parliament, the current family that is in governance. And there is a lot of work happening. 100,000 lives have been lost over the years of their their previous war. It's not a nice situation, and I think when we think about the current climate of how we're dealing with refugees, how we're dealing with people who are coming from areas where there is conflict. This is an area where the conflict is increasing, and we don't know how that is going to affect the neighboring countries or the people within that country. And of course, there will be, I'm sure, people fleeing the situation. And so something for us to bear in mind, that Sri Lankan people are demanding change, they're fighting for change, but we don't know how this is going to end up currently. Thoughts?
Look,
Oh, we took a deep breath.
I did, because I'm trying to not be. Look, the reality is it's hard for me to garner sympathy. You get the government you vote for. You deserve the government that you vote for. You may not always be the government you want, but you get the one that you deserve. And when I look at what happened in regards to the genocide that happened there and took place there, and the lack of remorse of what happened and occurred, I'm like,
Okay, well, we always disagree on the statement that you get the government you vote for, because doesn't actually work out in the wash.
no, you get the government you deserve.
I don't think you get the government you deserve. That is, we disagree on that point, but I do think it's something that we need to bear in mind that is happening. Of course, there are. I think in the world that we live in currently, we have all of our focus in certain areas, which means that sometimes atrocities are going to fly under the radar and people are going to do worse things. And I think we need to shine a light on things like what's happening in Sri Lanka, so that these people that are protesting aren't slaughtered, so that we can actually hold the governments there to account, so that we can actually be a support to those people and not just turn a blind eye, as has been done in the past, and pretend that we don't know anything, when the international community is well aware of these things, and can put pressure on governments to, we've seen it with the Ukrainian war, we see it all the time. They can put pressure, they well and truly know how to put pressure on governments in order to encourage better behavior and governance of their people. So I think it's something that we need to bear in mind. Many people will not be focused on that, but I think those from the Sri Lankan community would appreciate us at least learning something of the region and turning our attention somewhat towards what is happening there and the humanitarian crisis that is growing, and that, it continues to be problematic. So yeah, that's the first news story for today. That's where we're at with that. The second news story for today comes to us from Great Britain. We are enjoying Partygate, as it's being known now. It's hilariously ridiculous. So basically now this is how things come full circle. So Boris Johnson has had a series of intentional wrongdoings. I don't think we can say they're blunders or mistakes. They're intentional wrongdoings. It's happened under his watch. It happens under his government. It's a constant slew with him, and he just does one wrong thing, very Trumpian, as they would say. He does one thing, wrong thing, follows it up with another. And so in this case, what we're looking at is the fact that during the height of the lockdowns, during the height of the pandemic, when everyone was locked up in their house, the Downing Street, under the guidance of Boris Johnson, were having parties. They were having after-work drinks. They were gathering together. There are lots of pictures, lots of evidence of the kind of behavior that they were getting up to. The police have now, under duress of everything, investigated, and they issued fines of £50 to the individuals involved. £50. There are businesses who, during that time, didn't lock up quick enough, or they maybe protested, have like thousands of pounds, like individuals who were fined thousands of pounds. I do remember at one point one of the celebrities had a birthday party. She was fined something like £3,500 for having a birthday party, but our leaders got fined £50. So as you can imagine, opposition parties are up in arms, and they have been trying to put pressure on the fact that this government and the leader should step down, that it is not in the nation's best interest to have somebody who lies, etc., etc., etc. But this is where it gets, of course, always is the case. If you are trying to hold somebody to account who does something wrong, expect that you will be made into the boogeyman. And while I'm no Keir Starmer fan, he is the opposition leader of Labour, I am not a fan of his. The newspapers are filled, the press is filled in Britain with stuff saying that Keir Starmer needs to stop with Partygate. He needs to stop putting pressure on and just get down to work. Because honestly, has he not got better things to do than to chase the Prime Minister down and hold him to account? And surely we should just move on now. I kid you not, you can't make this stuff up. It is, I smile because that's the only thing I can do. You've either got to laugh or cry, and I've chosen laughter. It's the last dark side. I'm keeping the smile on my face because that's the only thing I have for you. So what you're telling me is that the leader of a nation can create rules for the entire nation, flout them, do exactly what he wants, mislead, lie, bewilder, create all kinds of drama and problems, employ all kinds of tactics to avoid taking responsibility for the fact that he did something wrong. He was in the wrong. He knew what the rules were. He repeated them every Friday evening. And then immediately after repeating them on a Friday evening, went and had drinks in the garden and had a great old party. And basically, while people were losing their lives, mourning their lost loved ones, couldn't go and visit people in the hospital, while other people who flouted the rules got fined thousands of pounds, this man gets a £50 fine. And the opposition says, yeah, that's not good enough. We don't accept this. And so instead of the media keeping the pressure on the person who did the wrongdoing, the media have turned their attention to the opposition and said, oh, is this the only thing you can talk about? Isn't there other things you should say? How can you keep doing this? Mr. Storm.
Look, the UK is a banana republic. Right? Let's just be real about this. It's a banana republic.
Oh, Lord.
You had the police refusing to investigate criminality, right? So that the mayor of London had to force the police commissioner to resign because the police commissioner was refusing to investigate criminality within the government.
You can't make this stuff up. You just
right?
can't make it up.
Under normal times, any decent prime minister would have resigned. But we are beyond that. You know, we are beyond politicians having to tell the truth. Right? We are beyond any facade of maintaining law and order and equality for all under the law. That has clearly gone. We have lost all civility within what should be democratic governments. You know, we're at the point where you cannot call somebody within Parliament in the UK a liar, despite the fact that the person is getting up and repeatedly lying, and they are demonstrably lying.
Yep.
Right? We are now at the point today where Angela Rayner, you know, was subject to misogynistic slurs, you know, by Tory MPs. Right?
And they're so bad that the biggest misogynist had to actually come out, and it was like a twist of irony that even the biggest misogynist in the party had to come out and say, no, y'all have gone too far. It's too far. Leave the woman alone.
Right? Yeah, I'm like, look, under what metrics would you regard the UK now to be a free and just society? All right. So look, I'm not surprised by any of this, and the idea that the newspapers would defend Johnson and his actions is simply par for the course. You have to remember he worked for them and still works for some of them.
That part, right? That part right there.
So they are continuing to pay this man despite his track record, despite his lies, despite his dishonesty. You know, I mean, look, the man is literally stealing from the British people because he's stealing a living, because he's not actually doing the job that he should be doing.
He really isn't. He really isn't. I don't. It's the biggest. It is a really big. It feels like a big con and a big scam. Like that's how I feel about British politics at the moment. It's like it feels like an episode of Hoodwinked or something. It doesn't sit right.
Let's put it like this, right? If people were, if somebody went to the government or the government was found to be handing out contracts worth billions to their friends for products and services that never came to fruition, right? All these politicians will be lining up to say, hey, that African country is corrupt, right? These leaders are corrupt. They need to go. You can't trust them with money, right? But yet, how many billions disappeared during the COVID pandemic?
Oh no. Oh no.
How many billions were given to people? I mean, the biggest fraud of all was the government awarded a contract to a shipping company that had no boats.
Sorry. If you don't laugh, you'll cry, people. If you don't laugh, you'll cry. That's the only thing you can do. And they paid them and never been held to account.
Right.
No,
And
you don't get a refund as taxpayers. You never get your money back.
That's the point that I'm making. Nobody was held to account. Nobody within the government. No criminal charges were ever filed against these people. Nothing was ever done.
Yeah. The best that we got was the fact that I forget the lawyer's name. A brown woman from I forget which community had to take private suits out against the government twice to hold them to account. She's had to do it herself.
Yeah, but all that meant was the government got told off for not following processes. Nobody has had to repay any money, and nobody has gone to jail for this.
No.
Right? But as I said, had it been any African nation, the amount of slurs you would have heard against these people.
Yeah, indeed. Well, this brings us nicely on to my third story before our joint story. So my third story actually brings us nicely onto this. So it has been revealed that the NHS is paying close to, or is paying in excess of $2 billion a year to private hospitals for mental health patients. And the fears are increasing that there is a growing number of bed shortages that have left the NHS increasingly reliant upon the independent sector. Now, 2 billion, a lot of money by anyone's stretch of the imagination, but the NHS spends 14.8 billion on mental health services. So that is 13.5%. What I want you to look at is this. 9 out of every 10 of the 10,000 mental health beds that are run by private mental health operators are occupied by NHS patients, which means that they are entirely making a profit from the NHS. I had to let that process in. So people are opening up these facilities, and they are entirely private. They're there to make a profit, and 90% of the beds are taken up by NHS patients, and they are making a profit. This has increased dramatically. So in 2005, the amount paid to private facilities was 951 million. We are now at 2 billion that is being paid. This is how bad the NHS has been pushed to the brink that it has to rely on these private beds. Now, there are a number of stories that come alongside this, which is that the independent care providers have persistent failures, sometimes fatal. There were a number of stories that were quoted in this article talking about suicides, etc. And we've looked at mental health issues for a long time now, at different aspects of it. We haven't fully talked about it here on the dark side yet, but there are a lot of problems. So figures out show that 71 different psychiatric facilities are run by non-NHS providers that are looking after adults or under 18s were found to be inadequate since 2017. More than 1 in 4 of the total 269 units. So a quarter of the units that are running NHS facilities, running private facilities that the NHS are booking into, are inadequate for the services they are supposed to provide. Especially when you look at mental health patients being, of course, particularly vulnerable. And this was looking at under 18s. So a quarter of them are not providing the service, which means that people are literally losing their life in these facilities. Literally, these are some of the numbers that are coming out. So I really wanted to just touch on this story because it's a massive story. It's huge. It talks about the fact that these providers are making typically a 15 to 20% profit on that's the profit margins that they have. And yeah, it is regulated, of course, but the regulations are falling short. The facilities are not being serviced in the way that they should, even if they receive an inadequate. This is for 5 years that people have received an inadequate. Nothing has changed within those facilities. In fact, the sector is getting worse and there are more and more tragedies, more and more stories coming out. Mental health, of course, now, because of the last 2 years, is one of our biggest areas of medical need at the moment, particularly. And with that output, of course, these facilities are making 15 to 20% profit margins on the patients that they have. They're making that on the back of the NHS. The NHS is, of course, for those of you that aren't from the UK, it's a service that is provided to all people where it's free at the point of need. But we do pay for it. It's not as if it's not paid for. You know, we contribute with our NHS payments. You know, the government has budgets. It's not like it's free entirely. There are payments made, but the fact that there is this profit sector, when we look at where the rise has come from, it has come under Conservative governments. Okay. Mr. Storm, any thoughts? I could continue to go on this to talk about this story for quite some time.
I'm gonna be fair here and say, look, the Conservatives, Labour cut the NHS budget. We have to be fair. The Labour Party cut the NHS budget, but the Tories have literally gutted it, right? And I think people need to stop falling for this for the smoke and mirrors and the lies that Boris Johnson gives. I mean, every budget he comes out and he says, you know, nobody has given the NHS as much funding as we have. Well, you cut the funding, and in real terms, in real figures, the funding decreases year on year. And what we're looking at is death by 1,000 cuts of the National Health Service, because the Conservative aim is to privatize it.
Yeah.
So what you're seeing here is the fruition of that.
Yeah.
They cut the funding to the NHS, which meant the NHS in turn cut funding to mental health services, which meant that they no longer had the capacity to take on mental health patients. But of course, they're obliged to treat people with mental health problems. So when the people come, what are you going to do? Where are you going to put them? Where are you going to send them?
Privatization by 1,000 cuts.
Right. Look, once again, this is part of the problem of you get the government you deserve. It may not be the government you want, but it's a government you deserve. And if you are so concerned about the foreigners coming to take your job, rather than the fact that there's people in power and in government that are robbing you of billions and giving it to their friends, then this is exactly what you deserve. I'm sorry, but that's just the way I see it. The Tory government have a history of this. You know their history of doing this. And the fact of the matter is, they turned around during a pandemic. If this doesn't tell you just how bad and bold-faced this government is, where they could turn around and tell National Health Service staff, during a pandemic, we're going to clap for you. We won't give you a raise, but we will give ourselves a raise.
Indeed.
Right? Because we worked hard during the pandemic. And you still vote for this government? I'm like, I don't understand how you can't tell me that the British people don't have the government they deserve.
Well, as we have said numerous times on this show, the majority of the British public do not vote Conservative. It's that their vote is split, and that can be problematic. So the majority do not vote for this, sadly, but that's a different matter altogether.
No, but enough people that are negatively affected still vote for it. The turkeys are voting for Christmas.
Indeed, there is a voting problem. I mean, no one should be voting to cut mental health services and to cut nationalised services. I agree with you, but at the same time, when you make a sweeping statement like they get the government they deserve, well, actually, no, the British public don't overwhelmingly vote for Conservative. It's just that those people who are like that vote in a block, and everyone else who's opposed to that votes in a split, which causes a problem when you have the way that the system works in the UK for voting. But that's a slightly different issue. We are going to move on to the big news of the night. The French election was had today. Votes have just closed at 8 o'clock Central European time, and it shows that Macron is the first president in 20 years to be re-elected. Let us not rejoice. He was up against Le Pen, and Le Pen, of course, is notorious. This was her last go at obviously trying to become the president of France, and he won, but he won by 57% to 42%. That looks like what the numbers are currently, and that's the exit polls. There is some projection that it's actually increasing his when they're counting it's at his percentages getting larger. But make no mistake, if you think that you have problems in the UK with these types of governments that are very anti-humans, and you've had the same problems in the USA, make no mistake that Le Pen getting 42% of the vote sends a resounding message that there is a problem in France, and this election will not have resolved it. That problem is growing, and the right-wing extremists are getting stronger and bolder and becoming more palatable to the mainstream of people. So her margins was higher, so she may not win, and that may have been her last we don't know for sure. She said it was her last go at being president, but there will be someone else, and that is a whopping 42%. Macron has a lot of work to do if he thinks he's going to turn the tide on that kind of grouping and that kind of opposition to him and his party. And I think that, one of the things that I think is really important is notoriously he will underestimate the strength of the opposition. And I think that's problematic. Instead of being true to his promises that he's made during the election instead of being true to those things. And this was one of the reasons why people have stopped voting for him to a certain degree and joined the extreme right-wing hateful group. Let's not mince words about it. They tried to put a pretty face on Le Pen, but her politics is anything but pretty. We talked about this last week. This is really problematic. Yes, he won, but this is not by any means, I think, a chance for a celebration. I think there is a lot of work to be done, and I think we are seeing problems throughout white cultures, to be honest, with extremist, nationalistic, far-right extreme parties, if I'm putting it bluntly. So there you go. That is our other big news story that I will be bringing. Mr. Storm, Macron won. Congratulations.
What you congratulating me for?
I don't know what to say.
One, the man has no real impact on my life, and two, the man a fool. Look, this is not a good news story in any way,
No.
shape, or form, because the reality is Macron is not going to try and shift France back towards the center. We have seen it time and time again that when you have the rise of these parties, even the centrist and the leftist parties shift further to the right. There is no real attempt to pull people back to the left or center.
Yeah.
So I expect Macron's policies to shift further to the right.
Yeah.
And the reality is that France was doing so anyway
Right.
under his tenure.
Right. Yeah.
But I dread to see what it's going to be like now. And in some ways, it's much more dangerous to have someone like him in charge than Le Pen, because Le Pen would be outright in your face about it, and people would people are more likely to take to the streets about it.
Yeah, absolutely.
Right? Whereas Le Pen dresses up his prejudice in pretty language and the idea or notion that he is somewhat a centrist when he's not.
No, we've reported on stories out of France over the last 2 years, and they've been horrendous stories. There has been nothing pretty that has come out between the racial tensions that have been happening over there. Some of the gaffes, if I put it like that he's made, the insults that he's flung at African nations, things have not changed under his tenure. People have really difficult relationships with the colonial power that is France, and that has gotten worse under his leadership, and I don't think it's going to get any better. The fact that he pretends to be centrist is very frustrating. It was evident on the streets that it was frustrating. Every interview I saw with French residents, of course, they're presenting you the news that they want you to hear, so you have to be mindful of that. But it was really disturbing to see as many people saying, well, I did vote for Macron in the last election, but he's lied, he's done this, he's done that, we don't like him, so I'm going to have to vote for Le Pen. And just as if this was an option, as if this was something that you should do. The fact that you would even put your vote in with somebody who is out and out as extremist as she is really scary. And the fact that it is in large part Macron's doing. And if he doesn't recognize that, and if he doesn't do the work, which inevitably, as you say, these leaders tend not to do. We're seeing it at the moment, of course, play out in the United States with Biden. They tend to try and pander more to the extremist instead of holding their ground and holding their majority and winning people over to their side. They tend to bend under the pressure to win more of the extremists and move to a much more right-leaning. And in the end, all politics then leans right, which I think for white European countries, this is something that they need to reckon with, and it's happening throughout Europe. It's not just happening in France. You know, we've seen the extremism in Hungary, we see the own extremism in the Netherlands, you see it all over these parties which and political people who shouldn't have the amount of influence that they do, but somehow, just somehow, they're managing to get a foothold in that. And I think that's something that needs to be reckoned with.
Yeah, look. Yeah. I I have no real faith in European politics. I just don't see anything of real worth or note coming out of it anytime soon.
Well, I think, you know, for me, if I stand back and take a historical perspective, I think this is something that we really do need to have conversations. And this is why anti-racism work is so important and anti-colonialism work is so important. Because I think if you're not reckoning with those things, this cycle of extremism continues. We've seen this in a wider historical context. This has happened and will continue to happen until the white majority, nations that are white majority nations really reckon with their own histories and deal with their racism and deal with their colonial ideas, because people are being continually to be manipulated and fed the lies of colonialism. You see it in the education system, you see it in the media, you see what the powers that once were. I mean, we didn't cover this news story, but Boris Johnson went to India to firm up a deal between India and Britain. Now that Brexit is done, let's do that. And it was filled with, I mean, the problematic language that was used, the insulting way that he behaved. I mean, it was just a puddle of colonial mindset, and the people lapped it up. Yes, the Indian people will be trading with us again, and you know, it's back to our colonial, you know, good glory days. What? You mean when you subjugated a whole entire nation and population, and they're still reckoning with the problems that you started in their nation to this day? Their religions have never recovered. The people have not recovered. And now you want to go back to your glory days and do what with the people? No, what? Hold on. Let's just pause. But I think the fact that we're not reckoning with that means that there is an idea that is prevalent within white culture, that is, we need to return to the days when we are on top and we are wealthy and we are the ones that everybody loves and does.
Yeah, it's MAGA for Europe.
Yeah. But this is the idea that's coming out, and I think that this is something that, you know, yeah, I think it's something that needs to be reckoned with, and I think if they don't tackle it, we are going to be stuck with this Boris Johnson, Le Pen, so on and so forth throughout Europe.
For the past few years, there's been a real rise of nationalism within European countries, and you've seen it in the elections that take place over here. Nationalistic and far-right parties have been gaining more and more of the vote in pretty much every European country for, I'd say, the best part of the past 10 years.
Yeah.
And in part, that is why I am against the concept of nations and countries.
Oh, here we go. Here we go.
Right. Look, the reality is that nationalism is the kissing cousin of racism.
I think nationalism is it's a power trip, isn't it? You know, that's really what we're talking about. We've, you know, because we can, yeah. I mean, that's not what our show's about today, and I know you have a few news stories that you want to get to. It's something that you've said to me before about the idea of being a nation, and I thought, well, you know, I'm proud to be Bayesian. I'm proud to be where I'm from, blah blah blah. And he's like, no,
I'm proud of my culture.
No, yeah, this is what you said to me, and I'm like, oh, okay. And thinking, well, how do people, you know, monitor the movement? And he's like, well, why would people move as much as you think they're going to move? And I was like, hold on, how much of a colonial mindset have I been fed that even I can't reckon with the fact that we could live without these these ideas of nations in the way that we have them currently, and that's a whole different dark side. That's a different dark side altogether. The dark side of nations is something maybe we'll cover in the second half of season 4. We'll see.
I'm simply going to say this: when people talk about nations, especially in a modern day context, it is more to do with wealth and power and the exclusion of others, right? And it's about maintaining that system of power and wealth. Because the reality is, let's look at it like this, right? Pick a country.
Morocco. That's the first one that came to my head.
So say I'm Moroccan, right? And the president of Morocco comes out and says, "We are going to war." Dude, who is we? You ain't going nowhere. You sending other people out to war. You sending other people out to die. Don't talk to me about we. And the reality is, whoever we are at war with, if we lose, chances are my life isn't going to be impacted that much because it was pretty crappy to start with.
Well, there is that.
Right? So when we're talking about this concept of nationhood, and all, what's it really got to do with me, who's living, the average person living on the ground?
No, it's true. It's very true.
And it may sound callous in regards to what is currently happening in Europe at this point in time, right? But the reality is, if people had just said, "Look, you know what? We're not going to war," and the reality is, most people are, if you think about it, the only thing most people care about is, do I have food? Do I have home? Am I safe? You meet those needs. Most people don't care who's in charge. The only question is, are the people in power going to meet those needs? And to be honest, I don't care who's in power. My honest feeling is, if Putin were to roll into the country today and say, "You know what? I'm going to make sure you have a house. I'm going to make sure you have food, you have health care. You know, you have all your needs provided for." I don't give a damn if he's in charge. That's just the reality of it.
But since we have nations, we care. Good. Excellent. No, I mean, I understand the wider concept of what you're saying. I think it's very difficult to apply it to what we're dealing with now, just because we do care. You know, he's rolling into towns and he's destroying people's lives. And I think that, you know, he's gutted whole cities, he's gutted whole neighborhoods, he's destroyed, you know, homes that people lived in. You know, people will be rebuilding their lives for many, many generations to come. You know, even if he rolls out again, there's problems. And the fact of the matter is, even if he rolls in and they wave the white flag and say, "We don't care, fine, whatever, as long as you provide something," he's destroyed everything to do it. So I think that there are some problems with saying it in this current context.
Absolutely. Absolutely.
I do understand the point that you're making, that nationhood has brought about an identity that is founded on not very much. And in fact, it's founded on the blood, sweat, and guts of the people. Because if we look at how the Russian soldiers, some of them have reacted to having to go into their neighbor's house and be the aggressor, they've responded very badly to this. They haven't responded very well. They've responded with, "We didn't want to do this. This is not what I signed up for. The people didn't welcome us. I thought we were just going in and the people were waiting for us and it was all going to be fine. What do you mean we have to blow people up? We didn't sign up for that. I thought they wanted us to come." You know, and I think that teaches us that really at the heart of the issue is the fact that it's about power. And the power-hungry top people are what is causing some really big problems.
I said this to you, I think earlier this week it was, or it may have been last week. I don't understand why Lizzie's getting paid all this money, right? Because this is my view. She's a benefit scrounger, right? She getting all this money. She getting paid all this money.
Tell them the
all
actual
this,
story before you do. After you, like, skip this bit and tell them the actual story, because I find this quite amusing.
what was the actual story?
The actual story about the fact that actually what royalty should do for your nation
Oh,
is
yeah,
they
yeah,
should
yeah.
be the one
Right.
to fight the
So,
yeah.
look, this is my view on royalty, right? You getting paid all this money, and people are saying you do so much for the country, but you ain't doing jack all, right? You sitting in a nice palace, being fed by your personal chefs, people waiting on you. You got your pretty much Eddie Murphy coming to America, you know, people wiping you behind, all the rest of that, right?
Mhm, mhm.
What is it you're actually doing? Now, here's the thing. I have no problem with monarchies. If this is the only reason I can see a monarchy existing, right? I'm happy to pay you all that money if when a conflict arises, you go off and fight somebody in single combat to the death, winner takes all. Then I'll say, yeah, you're doing something for the country. If you just sit in a nice, pretty palace telling other people you need to take your behinds off and fight so I can continue to sit in my palace and get all this money, then I'm sorry, you ain't doing nothing. And I have no use for you.
So there you have it, people. Kings and queens, single combat to the death. All right. Next news story, Mr. Storm. What do you have for us next? We'll get
Right.
dragged down that
So,
rabbit.
the one that I want to speak of or bring up is the attack on the mosque in Afghanistan.
Mhm.
Um, I think, especially since Western nations have pulled their presence out of the country, it's often ignored what's happening there. And there was an attack, a bomb attack on a Sunni mosque in Afghanistan that killed 33 people and injured 43 others.
Mm.
Um,
Happened during
and it
prayer
was
Friday, right?
Thursday, right? No, maybe on Friday.
Friday prayer.
But there were 4 attacks on Thursday. So there were
Mm.
4 other attacks on Thursday. And it was carried out by IS, Islamic State, right? So I think one of the issues or the points that I'd like to bring up is that people have been so focused on the Taliban
Mm.
that they ignore the fact that Islamic State still exists,
Mm.
right? And I think one of the worst crimes in all of this is the failure of Western nations to deal with Islamic State. You might not like the Taliban, but the Western nations and allied forces had a direct hand in the creation of Islamic State.
Mm.
They funded and they armed insurrectionist groups in Iraq, because remember, this comes out of ISIL, Islamic State in Levant,
Mm.
right? Who became Daesh, and they metamorphosize the names all the time. It's
Mm.
kind of like they're playing hide the shell, 3 card Monty or something like that, with who these people actually are by changing the names all the time. So you never make that connection to the fact that Allied forces created these groups, right? And so for me, the crime is that Western nations pulled out, and you might not like the Taliban, but you're not helping them when you should be in terms of cleaning up the mess that is IS,
Yeah.
right?
Mm.
So you have people over there, and you talk about the Taliban, and you want to talk about the atrocities that they may carry out towards their people. But when groups that you funded, you started, that you began, that you encouraged are committing atrocities that
Mm.
are quite likely as bad or worse than what the Taliban are doing, you're silent on it. You ignore it.
I just, the thing that really strikes me about this story is there's been this really, I don't know what it is when you call when it's against a religion, what the term would be, but anti-Muslim rhetoric that we've had to deal with in Western countries for quite some time. But when you hear something like this, when you hear the fact that it is the everyday average Muslim going to temple, doing their prayers, that's being attacked, you think this isn't about what you think it's about. It's not about that, and it's not about your Muslim neighbor, and it's not about the mosque down the end of the road. There is a real problem with power, and that has been funded and fueled, as I say, and has been lit a fire under and then abandoned by Western nations to just allow them to deal with by themselves. Sorry, and all these people are now suffering as a result of that. Excuse me for a moment.
Yeah. Okay. So, yeah, all these people are suffering. Look, I think one of the things that also has to be brought out of this, as you say, is that, or that needs to be explicitly stated, is this isn't a question of Muslims wanting everyone else to become Muslim, because these people are all Muslim. So when you're in the US or the UK and you're talking about, oh, these people, they want us to convert to Islam, they want to impose Sharia law. These countries already have Sharia law.
What are you talking about?
It was never about Sharia law.
No, it never is. It never is, sadly. Yeah, I think this is a really sad story, and of course our hearts go out to people who will now be trying to recover, and the faith communities that are being decimated. And we know that this is part of the terror that they rain down on people, is to attack them when they are praying, because that message is frightening. And we see that across the globe happening. But this is a particularly terrible story. Yeah, it's not good. Not good at all. Alrighty, you have one more. I saw you had some other stories you wanted to cover today.
Yeah. So in the US,
Oh, this is heartbreaking.
yeah, the leading cause of death in children was previously car accidents. It is now gun deaths. So the leading cause of, or this was for 2020, the leading cause of deaths of children in 2020 is gun deaths. New England Journal of Medicine reported that it had gone up nationwide by 33.4%. Okay. If this doesn't tell you that your nation has a gun problem, I don't know what will. And if the idea that your need to own a gun outweighs the value of lives of children, you might want to sit down and rethink your priorities. And you can talk about the idea of it's my constitutional right. Okay. It's my constitutional right to own a firearm. Okay. It's my constitutional right to say a lot of things, freedom of speech. I can pretty much say what I want. It doesn't mean that it's a good idea for me to do it.
It's not without consequence.
It's like me. I wouldn't walk into a meeting of the Ku Klux Klan and scream out, "Down with Whitey." It's my constitutional right to do it.
It's probably not smart.
But it doesn't mean that it's a good idea to do it.
I know what you want to do. No.
And so I think the proliferation of firearms within the US and the lack of controls that go alongside it is extremely problematic. And the idea that it's your constitutional right, so I should have one simply because it's my constitutional right,
Mm,
is troublesome.
mm,
Um, as I said, especially with the lack of control, and also on top of that, the lack of training. So I think it's Switzerland that per capita has a similar number of guns to the US.
mm,
But in order to own a firearm over there,
mm,
the amount of background checks and training you have to go through before you can do so um, means that actually the amount of homicides or deaths due to firearms, even accidental death
very
due to
low.
firearms, is minuscule
Yeah, yeah,
by comparison.
yeah.
So it is possible for people to still own firearms, but it's also possible for you to bring the number of deaths down.
Yeah.
And so, as I said, my question is, why don't you want to do that? There's a problem with your priorities.
Yeah, I think this is overall a really troubling, painful story because you knew that there were just so many stories of heartbreak. You know, as a parent myself, I couldn't imagine losing my child. Of course, that's not as a parent would, but I cannot imagine losing my child to a gun. It's yeah, incomprehensible for me to think that that's what it is. But what was really interesting to me was the top three. So guns, cars, and drugs. And what gave me pause for thought is that these are areas, the cars aside, so guns and drugs, you know, the US have had the biggest war on drugs. They've had all of this investment in, you know, the DEA and all sorts of different, you know, different organizations there who deal with drugs. And yet still the biggest killer of children, third, number three, is drugs. And I thought to myself, it didn't work. All that effort, all that money you wasted with this war on drugs, and drugs is still the third biggest killer of children. And it just makes me question, if I put together the picture of what it is like to be a child in the United States. So guns, cars, drugs, biggest killers, but then missing, the amount of children that go missing every year in the United States is frightening. The amount of children that don't have safe access to water, the amount of children that are homeless. It seems to me that your society is sending a really loud and clear message, which is if you manage to survive childhood, good for you, because we've got no desire to give you an education, to make sure you have healthy drinking water, to make sure you have a safe place to live, to make sure that your life is actually safe, that you aren't stolen, that you aren't abused. The safeguards that are in place in your society are not there to safeguard children and people. It seems to me that if a child survives childhood in the United States, that should be something you celebrate because it bucks the trend for your statistics. Your statistics tell us a really frightening picture of what life is like in the United States of America, coupled with the fact that even if you manage to live in a decent neighborhood and go to school, your high schools, I'm sorry, what is that about? The amount of bullying and hierarchy and all of this mess that y'all got going on in that school, to the point that you have children, of course, who come in with guns to kill other children. Something's fundamentally wrong with it seems to me as an outsider, with the concept of childhood, with the concept of how you look after children, with the concept of that there should be children and that children should be safe and sacred. Maybe I'm extreme because I live in the Netherlands, where it seems to me that our society believes that children are sacred, but this is it's really frightening that this is the picture that time and time again these statistics seem to bear out, that the life of the average child in the United States of America is not one of joy, safety, and education. It's one where they're struggling to eat, they're struggling to live, and they don't have anything to drink, and their lives are not particularly safe.
Look, I said earlier that the UK is a banana republic. Well, the UK is a banana republic and the US is a developing nation. You know, I'm the wealth disparity over there just means too many people are living in poverty and don't have adequate access to resources that you think people should have
Mm,
in a developed society.
mm.
Um, Look, also the war on drugs. The war on drugs is a myth.
It's a full out pretense to be racist. That's what that is.
Um,
But my point being.
it's about as real as the ships that the UK government was paying that shipping company for, right? Um, but the point is about violence and guns within US society.
Mm,
I don't want to get distracted by all the other failings of society over there. Um, and said, for me, I just look at it and I'm like, you cannot say to me that this is a good way to live. Um, and there's this notion, and in many ways, I understand where people are coming from with this, of this concept of protection. I need a gun for protection because these people have a gun.
mm,
What am I going to do if somebody comes with a gun? Well, the statistics show you're more likely to be shot with your own gun
mhm,
than by somebody else's,
mhm,
you know? So even that doesn't actually work out in reality. So this clamor to buy a firearm, I don't understand it, or at the very least, I don't understand why so many people are not in favor, not just of stricter gun control laws, but also laws that require training before you can have a firearm. And I mean proper training. So, yeah.
Okay. Alrighty. Well, we have. Are you going to do the last story, or are we going to leave that for next time, or are we just going to leave it with people?
What was my last story?
A rise in
Oh, yeah, yeah,
hepatitis.
we can leave it. We can leave it.
There has been a rise in hepatitis amongst children, and it has left health professionals completely baffled. Tune in next time on the dark side. I don't even know what
Listen,
to say.
as much as I'd like to go into it, it would take too long because you know the crazies are going to come out of the woodwork and talk about it's a vaccine, it's 5G, it's all the rest of it. It's the mark of the beast. You know these people crazy. So I just, because I can't give it the time that it's it should have. Um,
We're going to let it go.
I'll
Well, our
let it.
viewers were very quiet today, I must say. This is very unusual for them to be so quiet. Yes, indeed.
I
What
probably insulted enough of them. I mean, between the groups that I've insulted tonight.
you've insulted enough people for one night, but this is the dark side. What else could you expect from us if not Mr. Storm insulting people and me trying to find some middle ground somewhere in there? Well, we have enjoyed this first half of the season. We are finished for the season. We are on a season break, so we will see you in 3 weeks' time. In which case we will be back with new topics. Every time we've come back, I've got a little bit better at doing this, so let's hope that I can then as well. But we'll be back with new topics, more discussion, and more questions from you. There was something that we have forgotten, right? So there was a topic that we were asked to cover, which we didn't cover and we won't cover, The topic was that there was a student arrested in a university in the States who was sleeping or breaking it appeared to be breaking into or sleeping in the classrooms. That story, interestingly, turned out to be something quite other than what it presented as first, and it always pays to be a little bit more journalistic and dig into these things. So we didn't cover it because actually it turns out that lots of help had been offered and it had been rejected, and the last resort was to call the police and have the student arrested, or former student, not a student anymore, arrested, because it was actually beginning to be a menace on the women coming into the building, and he was beginning to be threatening towards women, it seemed. That story is still unfolding, so that is all I'm willing to say on that. Needless to say, it's within a Christian setting, and that always gives a troubling feel whenever we see these things. Our heart sinks and we do get very worried and nervous because unfortunately, Christians have done a very poor job of being Christians. It's a reality. So when we have these kinds of stories, your heart sinks and you do worry, but it does seem that there was more than what seemed to be on the surface. Right, that was my final update on that. Good. We're done. We're finished. You ready for vacation?
Yeah.
We have 2 weeks off of the dark side. We wish you every blessing in this 2-week period. We hope that everything is good. We will be looking out, I'm sure, for news stories that we will be covering to educate you on world events, anti-racism, anti-colonialism, and all other things that are the dark side. Have a good one, and we will see you in 3 weeks' time. I can't remember the date, but it's in 3 Sundays. Be blessed. Bye-bye.
Deuces.